The night had closed over the forest like an ancient jaw, damp and alive, breathing between the trees with a murmur that seemed made of secrets and forgotten threats. And the moon was nothing but a broken line, unable to pierce the dark ceiling of branches, while in that silence, so tense it almost hurt, a thin, trembling scream was lost like a spark in an ocean of shadows. It was the voice of a girl who should not have been there. The leaves stirred, the animals fled, and the entire forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew that something terrible was about to begin. Because that night, in the deepest thickness of the county, an autistic girl had disappeared, and what happened afterward would become the biggest search those roads had ever seen. Stay till the end, because this story proves that even in absolute darkness, brotherhood can ignite the light everyone thought was lost. Her name was Lia Carver, a 13-year-old girl whose mind observed the world with such intense sensitivity that it often became impossible for those around her to understand the inner map guiding each one of her steps. For her, sounds were not simple vibrations, but entire languages, dialects colliding with each other, rising and breaking with every door that slammed shut, while colors were echoes, silent murmurs that seemed to follow her even when she tried to escape. And every movement, every gesture, every shadow was a different universe, one that wrapped around her and overwhelmed her. She lived with her mother in a lonely house on the outskirts of the county, one of those isolated homes where silence weighs more than the walls, where the roads become broken threads, abandoned threads no one bothers to stitch back together. There, in that corner of the world forgotten by almost everyone, where the wind dragged leaves as if they were letters with no recipient, Lia found refuge in the few routines that held her together, until something broke the balance, and suddenly everything became too loud, too bright, too fast. That afternoon, the day had already started twisted, but it shattered completely after a brief, sharp argument with her mother. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a violent fight. It was the kind of clash that only happens when two tired hearts try to reach each other and can't find the way. A plate misplaced, a comment that sounded harsher than it was meant to be, a tear held back at the wrong moment, and the air became unbearable for Lia. The door slammed shut with a dry crack, the sound bounced off the walls like thunder, and the girl's hands began to tremble, moving as if they were searching for a rhythm that could calm the hurricane inside her chest.
And then she did what she always did when the world overflowed. She ran toward the forest. That forest, which for others was nothing more than a cluster of unremarkable trees, but for her was an almost sacred refuge, a sanctuary where sounds lost their force, where colors became familiar, where her thoughts settled with the softness of leaves under her feet. Her own labyrinth, and also the only place where she believed she could truly breathe. But that afternoon was not like the others. Night fell with unnatural speed, as if the clouds had decided to switch off the sky in a single motion. The temperature dropped, the humidity climbed up the trunks, and the rain began to creep along the leaves with the relentless precision of icy fingers. Lia, confused by the sudden change,
by the darkness thickening around her without warning, took a path she did not know, one she had never seen before, one she should not have taken. Her steps, once steady, became erratic. Her breathing, once soft, turned into a broken thread. What began as an escape turned into a silent wandering, and then into a fear she did not know how to name. Hours later, when the storm had already devoured the last of the light and dawn was still far away, her mother returned to the house. She found the door half open, the wind pushing violently into the home as if it wanted to show her what she did not want to see. Outside, on the soaked ground, there were irregular marks, small footprints that disappeared into the undergrowth and the darkness. And there, in that exact spot, the silence became so heavy, so deep, so definitive, that it could only mean one thing. Lia was lost. And that forest did not forgive anyone.
The first to notice Lia's absence were the closest neighbors, those who always peeked through the window when the wind seemed to be carrying bad news. They saw the door open, saw the mother running breathless along the path, and understood instantly that this wasn't a simple oversight. Soon the volunteers arrived, men and women carrying flashlights that shook more than their hands, stepping through the mud with the urgency of those who know that every minute can become an entire world for a vulnerable child. Then the county police arrived, late, far too late, not for lack of will, but because of that bureaucratic weight that crushes even when lives are at stake. Forms, calls, useless protocols that seemed written for kinder climates and forests less hungry. While the officers tried to organize themselves, the night had already extended its roots over the land, and the forest had swallowed Lia's trail as if she had never existed. They sent out powerful flashlights, their beams slicing through the fog, but finding no answers. The dogs sniffed the air, restless, unsettled, unable to follow a trail the rain had turned into a vanished whisper. Drones flew above the treetops, detecting false movements, shadows too alive, illusions shaped by humidity and wind. Nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Every passing hour became a sentence. Every echo that faded between the trunks made the volunteers' hearts tremble. And everyone knew something that no one wanted to say out loud. Lia could not handle sudden changes, intense noise, blinding lights, much less the deep darkness spreading between those ancient trees. The forest was a world that did not forgive, a territory that did not understand human fragility, and did not easily return those who stepped into it without permission. And then it happened. In the middle of that tension, in the middle of that anguish that seemed to grow with the wind, a sound shattered the stillness of the night like a firm, determined heartbeat, impossible to ignore. The harsh roar of a motorcycle. Then another, then another. They were not the nervous engines of volunteers, nor the official vehicles. No, this was different. A sound with weight, with memory, with intention. Because while the entire county drowned in doubts and protocols, the news had traveled to a place where excuses did not exist, where brotherhood was law, and where the suffering of a child never went unnoticed, the local headquarters of the Iron Riders. A band of bikers hardened by roads many wouldn't dare imagine, men marked by a code that wasn't written anywhere, but which they all carried on their backs like a second skin.
They did not know Lia. They did not know her mother. But they knew the forest. They knew its traps, its deceptive silence, its way of playing with human hope. They knew what the night could do to an adult. And they understood even better what it could do to a child, alone, scared, confused. And without anyone asking, without votes, without meetings, without permission, the decision began to ignite among them like a spark running through gasoline. Something had happened. And that girl was no longer alone.
The night, which until that moment had remained still like a watchful beast hidden among the trees, seemed to shatter into 1,000 fragments when the first engines began to rumble down Old Highway 14, a deep, constant roar that made the highest branches vibrate and forced the fog to retreat, as if even the forest understood that something much stronger than itself was stepping onto the scene. And so, between bursts of yellow light cutting through the rain and the wet crunch of mud under heavy wheels, the Iron Riders appeared one after another, forming a line of soaked steel and pure determination that turned the darkness into a stage of unbreakable purpose. The bikers climbed off their machines without hurry, wrapped in the deep sound of engines still dying under the storm, and gathered into a silent circle where the drizzle fell over their leather jackets as if marking a ceremonial rhythm, a shared heartbeat between men who knew all too well the blurry border between a life that vanishes without warning and the hope that can still be reclaimed. And at the center of that quiet circle, standing like a beacon in the middle of uncertainty, was Cole Maddox, a leader with an unyielding gaze and a voice scarred by old stories that didn't need to be told to command respect. Lia's mother walked toward him with an unbearable mix of fear, exhaustion, and a love so desperate it barely allowed her to stand. But Cole, without interrupting her even once, listened to her entire account, let every trembling word break against the hard wall of his expression, and finally nodded with a slow, deep, almost ritual movement, as if in that instant his soul had recognized the urgency and adopted it as its own. And that simple gesture, that minimal tilt of his head, was enough for the men around him to understand that the decision had already been made, that there would be no delays, that the girl was no longer alone.
Without the need for formal orders, without maps spread out over wet hoods or motivational speeches, the entire club understood that they had to enter the forest, divide the territory the way only they knew how, move without fear along every path, every route, every pocket of shadow where the night might try to hide what did not belong to it, because their code, silent yet unbreakable, did not allow them to abandon a lost child, nor to surrender while there was still a chance to bring them back. And so, with the precision of an old yet indestructible machine, they adjusted their flashlights, checked their radios, tightened waterlogged gloves, and began to move as a single entity, a brotherhood that had decided to face the forest on its own ground. And when Cole finally spoke, he did it with that deep, dragging voice that seems to light embers in the chest of those who hear it, uttering words that were not a promise or a vow, but a sentence. If she's in there, we're going to find her. The circle of bikers opened like a dark, determined tide, sliding into the depths of the forest with the absolute certainty that they would not return empty-handed. Because in their world, in their code, in their brotherhood, loyalty
always weighs more than fear. If you believe loyalty still has value in this broken world, subscribe to Hell's Road, because what's coming next will not leave you indifferent.
Preparation unfolded under the rain like a silent, precise, almost ancient choreography, while the bikers, soaked to the bone but sustained by a determination that seemed hotter than any fire, strapped massive industrial flashlights to their helmets, securing them with firm movements so the light could cut through the forest's thickness without trembling, and at the same time wired together improvised radios built from salvaged parts, reinforced batteries, and antennas screeching under the humidity, creating a rough yet unbreakable communication network capable of binding together the teams that would scatter in different directions. Around them, the maps spread out over drenched hoods looked like relics from another era, pages so wet that raindrops erased the ink, forcing the riders to redraw routes, mark danger zones with broad sweeps of their hands, while others lit small fires that crackled under the storm, not as sources of warmth, but as improvised beacons that would serve as guidance points for the groups entering the forest from different angles, forming a constellation of burning points that turned the darkness into a search grid. Their jackets, heavy with water, shone under the bursts of light as if they were ancient armor, dark and hardened by years of endless roads and nights that had left invisible marks. And in that moment, under the rain, under the trembling firelight, under the shadows of the forest that seemed to be watching them, the Iron Riders did not look like mere men, but like modern warriors, prepared to face a faceless enemy that left no tracks, made no sound, and showed no mercy. Time.
And as they organized, someone said what was already obvious, that the colors they carried on their backs, that patch, that symbol, that silent declaration of loyalty, did not stain with rain, or with night, or with the despair surrounding them. They were colors that remained firm, even when circumstances collapsed. They wore their colors like a shield, symbols of a loyalty that did not stain with rain or night. And you can carry that same spirit. All the official Hell's Road gear is linked below in the description. When Cole decided that each group was ready, that every radio answered, that every beam of light burned with enough strength, that fear no longer had a place in those men, he raised his hand in a brief, almost imperceptible gesture, but one so full of authority that it was enough to make all engines go silent at once, all conversations die, all tension reshape itself into pure focus. And then, with another gesture just as subtle, he gave the signal to move. The bikers scattered like arrows launched from the same bow, stepping into the thick darkness with long, steady strides, letting the night swallow them one by one, until the clearing was left empty and silent, and the largest search in the county's history began to unfold among roots, shadows, and held breaths. The rain fell with an almost conscious persistence, sliding down the leaves like an endless murmur that wrapped itself around the bikers as they advanced with their engines off so as not to shatter the forest's fragile silence. And that slow, almost ritual movement made the weight of their boots on the mud produce a wet, rhythmic sound that merged with the distant cracking of branches collapsing under the storm, weaving an atmosphere so taut it seemed to hang from a single invisible thread. And it was in that climate of waiting and held breaths that more than 2 kilometers from the last place where they believed Lia might have passed, Rourke, that silent giant whose size contrasted with an almost animal sensitivity,
raised his hand in a firm gesture that instantly stopped all the others, because he was not the kind of man to be fooled by illusions or misleading noises. The entire group stood still, gripped by the storm, listening beyond the sound of the rain, beyond the wind, beyond their own breathing, until at last they heard it, a tiny sob, so weak it seemed about to vanish in the dark, a broken little whimper repeating itself as it slipped between the trees like an almost snapped thread, a sound that belonged neither to an animal nor to their imagination, but to the raw fear of a lost child. And then the bikers moved almost in unison, leaving caution behind, pushing forward among roots that twisted out of the ground like gnarled hands trying to grab them, ducking under sharp branches bending under the weight of the water like invisible claws, slipping in the mud without stopping, guided only by that small whisper the storm kept trying to erase again and again. And it was thus, forcing the darkness back with their flashlights, that they emerged into a clearing where the moon, for the first time all night, managed to pierce the cloud cover and cast a pale, cold light over a patch of forest, like an ancient sigh falling from above.
There, under a fallen trunk that shielded her from the wind, was Lia, curled into herself, shaking with the desperate force of someone who has spent hours trying to hold back a world that is too loud, too chaotic, too big. Her hands pressed over her ears to stop the roar of the rain from drilling into her mind, her eyes squeezed shut as if that alone could keep the surrounding darkness away, her breathing broken into small spasms that spoke more of exhaustion than fear. Cole moved toward her with measured slowness, a slowness that seemed to defy both time and storm, because he knew that a single sudden gesture could destroy what little calm she had left. And so he knelt down in front of her with a gentleness that contrasted completely with his large, road-scarred body, leaning just enough so that his presence wouldn't overwhelm her, placing the flashlight on the ground, angled away to spare her the direct glare, allowing the moon to be the one to brush the scene with its soft, pale light. When he spoke, his voice was neither a command nor a plea, but a deep, warm murmur, almost paternal, a voice that seemed built to cross the storm without hurting, to reach her without pressing, to tell her without words that she no longer had to run, that she was no longer alone, that she could stop fighting against a world that did not always know how to treat her. And then he extended his hand, not like someone demanding, but like someone offering shelter, an open hand, empty, calm, steady, a hand that carried the simplest and most powerful promise at the same time: "Come with me. I'll take you home." Lia lifted her gaze with a tremor that ran through her entire body, as if that decision was so enormous it threatened to split her in two. But in the middle of the water, the cold and the fear, she found a tiny thread of courage, a thread she could barely hold, and she followed it. And in that small yet gigantic act, in that almost imperceptible gesture, she stretched out her hand and placed it in Cole's, closing in an instant the distance that had separated her from the world all night. In that moment, as if the forest itself exhaled for the first time, the radios crackled to life, voices overlapping, signals crossing, and the entire county heard Cole's unmistakable voice cut through the static with the clarity of a thunderclap that allows no doubt. "We've got the girl. We're bringing her home."
The bikers left the depths of the forest, with the girl protected at the center of their formation, moving across the waterlogged ground with an almost sacred solemnity, as if each one of them understood that they were not merely escorting a missing minor, but someone who, for endless hours, had been exposed to a world that did not know how to hold her. And so they formed around her a human shield made of one man in front, two flanking her with broad, steady steps, and the rest closing the march as a silent wall defying the night, turning mud, rain, and darkness into insignificant obstacles compared to the need to bring her safely back home. When they emerged at the edge of the clearing, where the volunteers were still waiting with their breath held, Lia's mother saw the small figure between the massive silhouettes of the Iron Riders, and her body collapsed before she could even control the emotion tearing through her from the inside, dropping to her knees on the wet ground with a tremor that shook every part of her being, while a raw, liberating, almost animal cry escaped her throat as her daughter ran into her arms, clinging to her with the desperation of someone who has returned from the edge of an invisible abyss.
There, under a rain that now seemed softer, as if it had grown tired of punishing the world, the mother held Lia so tightly it looked as though she feared the girl might vanish if she loosened her grip even for a second. And as the two of them stayed like that, joined together, crying in a silence broken only by the patter of drops on the earth, the bikers, soaked, exhausted, covered in mud up to their waist, watched the scene with the serenity of men who know they have fulfilled something that needs no applause or speeches. Because for them, the true reward was not public recognition, but the intimate certainty of having honored their code without hesitation. And so, faithful to that discreet way of understanding brotherhood, they began to leave, one by one, without making a sound, letting themselves be swallowed again by the mist and the dark, without waiting for thanks, without accepting praise, without seeking the spotlight, because they knew their part in that night was over, and that now the story no longer belonged to them, but to the girl who had returned, and the family that had recovered something the forest had tried to steal forever. There are roads that lead to redemption, and others that exist only to become memory. If you want to keep this flame alive and carry with you the spirit that held these men steady on the darkest night, the official Hell's Road store is linked in the description, where brotherhood continues even after the story ends. Days later, the forest went back to being the same, but something in the county had changed. Every time someone heard engines in the distance, they didn't think of noise. They thought of hope. Lia, still shy, left a drawing at the biker's door. A girl holding a lantern, surrounded by giants in black jackets. No one knew who had left it there, but the club framed it and placed it beside their most sacred memories. Because some stories are not shouted, they are kept like scars that teach. And this was one of them. This was one of the many forgotten legends of the road. If you want to ride with us through the next ones, subscribe to Hell's Road and ride into the next story.